You're listening to the People Agenda podcast, brought to you by leading HR, workforce and payroll transformation specialist, Lace Partners. Good morning, good afternoon and good evening and welcome to the latest People Agenda podcast. It's me, Chris Howard from Lace Partners. Thank you, as always, for joining us. And today's podcast is going to be one focused on a white paper that we produced, which, if you are a regular listener, then you'll be aware we've already had a couple of podcasts on our white paper that we produced in 2025, which is called From Implementer to Influencer, Redefining HR's Role in Business Transformation. And the premise of that white paper was we did quite a big chunky piece of research at the beginning and midway point of 2025, where we looked at HR's role in business-wide transformation, because quite often what we found at Lace Partners is that organizations find themselves, or certainly HR teams find themselves, leading on their own transformation for their own function, but people is a massive aspect of business-wide transformation. So what's HR's role in the people part of business-wide transformation is the question that we asked. And we got a nice research report together, which we released in the back end of last year. And we wanted to get some external inputs. And so that's what we've been doing for quite some time now. And we wanted to get another one before I introduce that person, that expert speaker that we've got today. I'm going to have my co-host come and say hello. Debbie Mitchell, come and say hello.
Hello. Nice to be back. My first podcast of 2026. It is 26, right? Yes, it is 26. Thank you for having me back, Chris, and really looking forward to our conversation today.
Me too. Now, I'm going to give a little bit of a hint to Debbie before we introduce our guest, because you just said it's the first podcast you've done of 2026. I'm going to give you the hint of today's fundamentally different question before we get into it. And that is, I'm going to need you to be thinking about New Year's resolutions that you have no idea in keeping. But we will come back to that in a second. Let's introduce our guest first and foremost. It's Hilary Gee, who is an executive coach. Hilary, how are you doing, sir?
I'm very well, thanks. And it's also my first podcast for 2026.
There you go. There you go. Tell us a little bit about your background, and then I'm going to try and befuddle you both with today's fundamentally different question.
I look forward to the befuddling. So I am, as you said, I'm an executive coach, and I've been doing this work and leadership development work since 2003. Prior to that, I'd had various commercial roles and leading into operations and general management. In the last 8 years of my working life, it was in HR services and running teams around recruitment, placement, training, coaching, and in particular, the last 3.5 years in East London, helping long-term unemployed. Our teams were doing that. For my sins, I did a part-time MBA, which doesn't necessarily teach you how to lead, but it does teach you how to think about different questions. And it really links with today's conversation, actually, about influence in the boardroom, influence at C-suite level, and how do we really get under the skin of different people and different focus areas within a C-suite team or within the boardroom. The kind of work I do now, I have a really enjoyable and varied mix. I work individually with C-suite leaders and with teams. I also design and deliver leadership development programs. I do about half of my work as a visiting coach and program director at London Business School, and about half is my own work. And there's a real mix of private, public, not-for-profit. And I'm also leaning into big concern of mine is the planet and the risks that organizations face from sustainability issues. And I'm running some workshops which are built around how do we start thinking and kickstarting sustainability work, whilst also building leadership and creativity and teamwork. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, and it's going to be really interesting to get into that, and particularly because that's one of the key bits you highlighted that we talked about in our research around that influencing the C-suite level. When I first joined Lace Partners 6.5 years ago, a lot of talk about how does HR get a seat at the table at C-suite? I don't think that's really a conversation anymore, because we talk with C-suite professionals and HR professionals all the time, CHROs, CPOs. It's not a thing as much, but there is a question around that role that they play on influencing, and that's what we're going to get into today. But I need to have my bit of fun first. That bit of fun is, as you both mentioned, we are recording this right at the beginning of 2026. What my fundamentally different question that I will ask both of you, and I'll go first to give you a few seconds, is, as I said, New Year's resolutions that you have absolutely no intention of keeping. And we are recording over a platform which obviously is visual, so we can see each other and you can see, but our listeners can't see. My New Year's resolution was, I'm going to give up drinking cola, or at least have less of it. What am I drinking right now? Yes, it's a cola. So a New Year's resolution that I've already failed within a day or two, had no intention of keeping, gave it a try, didn't work. Debbie, your go.
Thank you. I'm going to say mine was to do no podcasts in 2026. Had no intention of keeping it. Good ambition, no intention of keeping it, and failed already before the end of January. So here I am podcasting again.
That is a brilliant one. We can't keep you away. What about you, Hilary?
Cannot.
I'm going to reply slightly creatively, and that is, I have an old year's resolution that I keep on failing to implement, which is not to make any New Year's resolutions, because they always fail. So my approach to it, maybe this is a kind of truism for a coach, is it shouldn't just be about New Year. It should be about what's really working for me at any point, and what do I need to shift, and how do I shift it? So old year's resolution is don't do New Year's resolutions, but every new year I think a bit about it.
It's excellent. I love that. I used to say, what's the difference in a day? You didn't have a New Year's resolution on New Year's Eve, so why do you need one on New Year's Day? Anyway, that's a whole other podcast probably. I wanted to kick off, Hilary, if it's okay, just talking very briefly about some of the things that we found in the research that Chris mentioned, Implemented to Influence white paper. There were a couple of kind of nuggets in there that kind of led us to this conversation. In particular, we were interested in, at very kind of summary level, some of the findings of the research that we did were highlighting that, as Chris described, CPOs absolutely have a seat at the table, but there were some quite significant findings around their relationships in the C-suite and around their degree of influence within that C-suite as well. And so that's an area we'd like to explore a bit, because obviously the battle for the seat at the table went on for a number of years. We got there. That's great. And I'm not a fan of that kind of catchphrase these days that HR needs a seat at the table. We have one, and also we shouldn't ask one. We should just take it. But then, what the research found was just a couple of nuggets that I'll draw out. So the first one, lots of leaders were saying they see HR as an important part of decision-making during major business transformations. But there was still quite a significant proportion that saw HR as less central or less influential in that transformation process. And when we looked at why were they being less influential, one of the things that was talked about was just lacking the capacity and the capability to influence around that C-suite table. And found that particularly CEO-CPO relationship, in lots of organizations, the communication, the interaction was very rare. We know some of our clients and our friends in that role are in really regular interaction with CEOs, but in lots of organizations, there is that kind of gap. They're not connecting frequently. And so that can lead to like misunderstandings or misalignment on really important issues. And then there's issues around the CFO and the COO perception of the CPO, which is that they might not be fully recognised or appreciated. Their contributions are seen as less valuable, and the importance of the role overall doesn't seem to get the kind of weight. That was some of the key findings we had in the research that kind of pricked our ears up around, particularly how can the CPO really focus on developing some of that influencing capability and relationship building. And we've got some things in the report that are around breaking down silos, demonstrating contribution much better. But it's for this conversation, we wanted to focus in a bit about how do they build that relationship? What are some of the interpersonal skills, capabilities, things that they can try? What are some of the dynamics we see around the C-suite? And just really draw on your experience of that. So before I get into any detailed questions, having thrown all of that at you, I just wonder what's your immediate kind of reaction or response?
Yeah, I think the biggest one. This kind of links to my background originally I studied languages and I spent quite a bit of time learning German and French and working in Germany and France. And it may seem a roundabout way into this, but if you don't speak the language of the people you're working with, then they won't understand you. So if I go to France and I say, excuse me, what's the way to the station? People won't understand me. I go, same in Germany. So I've got to learn to speak their language. And that's one of the things is, are we speaking our language to people? Is it people language we're using as CPOs? Or are we actually using CFO language or COO language? Are we talking to the CFO about the economics around people decisions and around culture change? Or are we talking about values and the employee experience? And the CFO goes, yeah, how do you translate that into what's meaningful for me? And the COO, are we talking to them about culture? Or are we talking to them about operational bottlenecks? So some really important things about how do we translate what we're talking about and why it's important into the language of the person that we're trying to influence. There's also a second thing, and this is way more general than just CPOs. This is for everyone, and that is, how do I also do it in the style that will land with someone? An overgeneralized stereotype of a CFO is quite direct, bullet points. We've got to be quick. We've got these rules and regulations. And if you come along and say to me, hi, how are you? They're already going, oh my God, I'm going to waste half an hour with this person who's all touchy-feely. So and it's not all CFOs are like that, and some CPOs are more like that, but talking their language, using the kind of language they use, but also pitching in the right style. Are they shoot from the hip, bullet points at one at a time? The time is crucial. I'm coming in saying, have you got 5 minutes? And I've got to land my points fast. Or is this someone where I need to say, hey, can we grab a coffee and sit down for a bit? I'd love to hear a bit more about your challenges and so on. So how do I use the right language and how do I use the right style to make people feel connected and understood?
I really love that. And communication, the most important part of any type of interaction between humans within a business state. And one of the things that was just resonating with me as you were talking there, Hilary, was if you're able to speak the language and speaking the language of your audience, one-to-one or collectively understands, it becomes sort of a little bit disarming for them. I really liked your example when you just said that people like, oh, hold on a second, what's happening here? They're coming to me about this. If you're speaking in your language as opposed to speaking in their language, and that empathy. And so I guess really that disarming nature then comes down to the trust element as well, when you're to speak the language of the person that you're interacting with, and specifically when you're talking about those C-suite interactions. So can you give me some thoughts around how leaders can build that kind of trust amongst themselves when you've got these kind of competing agendas that exist? Is there any bits of advice you can give?
I think the competing agenda item is such a big topic that when you think of it at an organizational level, you've got to say, how does the CEO and the board challenge themselves to create metrics which actually break down the silos and create a team? If I'm the CEO and I have a team and I give one person, the marketing and sales people, one metric and the CFO another, and that they're in conflict with each other, then I'm not setting them up for success. So there's something here about, for starters, challenging how do we actually set up the CEO and the C-suite team to really become a team? Or are they treated as individuals and set up for competition? So that's a crucial thing. The balanced scorecard and shared metrics, that my goals are not just my metrics, but they're your metrics as well. When that's missing, then it's really hard to fight against the systemic context. So within that, one of the key things I'd be saying is you need to be saying, what have we got systemically that we need to change so that the relationships can become more collaborative? And until you've done that, you're going to be pushing water uphill.
I find that really interesting, Hilary. I don't know, in my previous life, prior to LACE, sat in lots of exec or senior leadership teams and watch them do their updates, going around the table as here's what finance have been doing, and here's what HR have been doing, and here's what IT have been doing, here's what ops have been doing. And I would always challenge, at the end of that conversation, they'd all say, why do we work in silos? And I say, because you're delivering your outcomes in that way. It's exactly what you're describing, as opposed to saying, look, what are our strategic kind of ambitions? And let's talk about that. And let's talk about, yes, you've got your sort of functional or technical specialism, but let's all contribute to how we're driving that and what's the success of it. So I think that really resonates with me in some of the things that I've seen previously.
And building on that as well, it's as a coach for individuals and teams, one of the things that I look at is, how do you actually build a team? How do you create that collaborative capacity and those relationships? And one of the best ways to build collaboration between people is to give them a joint task. Send them on a team building day. Can be fun, can be interesting, can be insightful, as long as it's led well and actually really leads back into the business. Lots of them aren't really. They're fun, they're social, they're morale building, they're connecting, but they don't lead back into what you actually do in the business world. And I get really frustrated with team building events that aren't really thinking about what behavior change are we going to have at the end of this.
Yeah, you build a lovely raft, but...
Yeah. But very often the best way to get a team collaborating is to say to them, Debbie and Chris, I need you two to put your heads together and come back and present to us as a team what you're going to do about this and what you need, and do bring the rest of us in, but I want the two of you to collaborate and bring something back to us. And that's going to build your teamwork and going to break down the silos more than if I say, Debbie, can you look at your bit? And Chris, can you look at your bit? And each of you come back separately. And thinking that at C-suite level, we can do siloed work is going to create an organization that is not connected at every level. It's going to be disconnected at every level.
Can I ask then, this is a really interesting sort of discussion that I want to expand on a little bit, from getting those C-suite professionals to work on almost projects together, or a task together, if you like. Because the first thing that came into my head when you were talking was thinking about, that's why obviously we advocate the importance of any work that an organization does, any work that a HR team does, has to link to business objectives. Otherwise, why are you actually doing it? The bigger business objectives. But it sounds to me what you're talking about more is, yes, we can all have those kind of, what are the business objectives for the next year, 5 years, or whatever it is? That's what we're working towards. But then actually, I want to drill into what you were talking about there, because it links to the question I've got around why is relationship building so difficult amongst certainly C-suite professionals? Because if you've got projects that people are working on in small groups within that C-suite, it's almost, you don't normally expect to see that. Why don't organizations do that at the C-suite? Is it just because C-suite professionals are so busy already, and so therefore it's getting time? So the CMO and the CFO and the CPO working on project together? Give me a thought as to why it's always such a challenge to build these kind of relationships through these kind of projects. Or is it a challenge from some of the clients you talk to?
I see it as really reflective of how the CEO is leading the C-suite. And recent example, 2 different subsidiaries of an organization I'm working with, they have one overall culture, they're sister businesses, they have some shared services between them. But the culture in those 2 sister businesses is really different, and it's really reflective of the CEO. And you walk into one C-suite, and these 2 businesses should be pretty comparable, but they really aren't. And it's just to see it's driven by the behaviors at the top. And in one of them, the behaviors at the top, the person who is now the CEO in that part of the business came from within the business and inherited a culture which has continued under them. And in the other one, there's a new CEO who's come in from outside, but there already was quite a good culture there, and she's continued to lead that. And it's the way she leads. She's really leading the C-suite rather than commanding the C-suite. And when you have someone commanding the C-suite, you create more fear. And with fear, people become more defensive. And when people are more defensive, they're less collaborative and creative. And they're doing a lot more covering their backs. and where there's a lot more openness and honesty from the CEO and authenticity about what's good, bad, difficult, and they're really leading rather than commanding the C-suite, you get a different culture.
And do you think the CPO has a role to, because we talk sometimes about the CPO as kind of the conscience of the organization, and so I just wondered, do you see the CPO as having a role in helping the CEO to navigate that leadership
Yeah, definitely
role?
And I think often the CEO can trust the CPO to really start thinking about organizational culture starting at the top. But sometimes CPOs are scared to say to the CEO, do you know, what I observe is our C-suite teamwork is driving the silos, and we need to do some work at that level. And it probably starts with you finding a really good coach who will really help you think about your leadership of the C-suite. And then it probably links into maybe doing a 360 for you with the C-suite, and then a 360 within the C-suite, and then some real kind of deep and quite tough individual and group work with the senior leadership team. And the CPO sometimes has to take their courage in both hands to have that conversation, or to somehow softly drip feed, or to find some real metrics, and to find a case study and bring it and say, look, can I really put something on the table here? Here's a case study that I think is relevant to us. And it's a bit confronting, but I think you need to read it. I think you need to think about it. And then you and I need to talk about, or we need to find a great executive coach that you really like, who you can work with, who can then help you think that through, because you've got some brilliant strengths, but some of the things that we're facing at C-suite and then below are about what you're doing and not doing that is undermining or creating or developing the C-suite team as a team of leaders or as a team of functional experts.
Yeah.
And so many organizations, people don't really learn leadership. They learn functional expertise, drive from the top, know how to manage their function, but they don't actually learn how to lead. And many CEOs don't know how to lead the C-suite either.
And it's leading the enterprise that's the kind of shift, isn't it? From that almost downward looking, I'm leading the function, I'm an expert, we know what we do, into that sort of shift that is, okay, I always describe it as I'm now looking up and across rather than I'm looking down and channeling my expertise. So that's quite a shift to make. And it's not an easy one, and it's not a much talked about one, I think, to be honest.
And there's a really interesting exercise I've done with one client where we've got them thinking about situational leadership styles and talking about what they do and then what they see the others doing. And they see themselves not just being authoritarian, not just being kind of pace setting, but they see themselves as being visionary and democratic and coaching and affiliative. And they all have a reasonably balanced sense of themselves across these. But when they look at everyone else, they see lots of coercive, lots of pace setting, and not much of everything else. And they're all, it's a little bit like, raise your hand if you're above average driver. More than 70% of people raise their hand. So there's the self-perception of how good I am as a leader at using different styles to become a really good leader. The self-perception is overinflated, and the critique of others is probably reasonable. But actually, if they took the critique of others and said, that's probably me, they'd be more accurate.
This is really interesting. We've only got a couple of minutes. I've got one question I want to ask just as a closing question, but is there any other kind of final bits from your side, Debbie, that you just wanted to ask Hilary whilst we've got them? I think what you guys are just talking about there really interesting. And Debbie, as you mentioned, like that kind of skills as a leader that are cross-board and not, the things that come into my head is the stereotyping. Oh, you're a CPO, so you must be good with the people side and the motivation side and the mentoring side and that. Oh, you're a CFO, so you have to be good with the numbers, and you're probably a little bit more aloof and you're standoffish and you don't interact as much. Oh, you're a CMO, so you're the creative one. It's nonsense. When you get into that level, it's about skills that are about leadership, and you should all have the similar or equal balance of all of those types of people skills, creative skills, like analytical skills. A good C-suite has that across them all, and then you all bounce off of each other. But Debbie, any kind of final thoughts before we go to that kind of close question that we want?
I just wonder whether there's any practical steps, Hilary, anything like forums, behaviours, rituals that you would typically see in organisations where the CPO is a really strong influencer.
Yeah, I think it links to what you just said, Chris. CFOs and the financial functional specialists for a long time were analytical, but they didn't bring much synthesis or ideas. They said, these are the accounting practices, this is what we tell you. They weren't really bringing a big business thinking approach. They were bringing a financial thinking approach, financial analysis approach. They weren't really being a proper business partner. They were the ones who said no. And there's a really big shift in financial function was to say, no, we're a business partner. We bring financial insights and knowledge and understanding, but we're a business partner. And I think one of the big shifts for CPOs is to think of themselves to really think of themselves as a business partner rather than just the conscience of the people or the conscience of the culture or the conscience of the values and behaviors. And they've got to be able to say, I bring a business brain. Yes, with a people background. But what I'm bringing in is business brain. I'm not just bringing people stuff. Business stuff, yes, with people back. And I think that's a shift that CPOs, now that they have a seat at the table, they need to bring much more, oh, wow, you're not just the CPO. You've got a business brain.
You are a business leader. Yeah.
Yeah, you're a business leader. And they've got to challenge the others to stop just being a functional leader, but to become a business leader, and to stop them being siloed functional leaders to become a really serious team who, like you just said, Chris, all bring creativity, all bring problem solving, all bring challenge, all bring playing devil's advocate, all bring, hey, let me help with that. And I loved one of the best things I've come across over the last 10 years. I really loved it. Was a story about Lego, and that the new CEO, when they had a bit of a dip, said, we're not going to win or lose by being creative or not being, or whatever. He said, it's 4 things to do with help. It's, do you notice when someone needs help, and do you offer help? Do you ask for help, and do you accept help? And I think that's a really powerful thing to talk about across the senior leadership team. Do we create a culture where I notice that you need help and I offer it, you ask for help and you accept it? Or do we have a bunch of egos, partly created by the culture in the room, because it's not being led as a team? And that's the shift that CPOs need to help CEOs lead, but also they can influence each of the other C-suite leaders by building great relationships, formally and informally, through ritual and just through chats, and by overcoming the distance that can get created because of remote working and working like this on Zoom, which the biggest barrier to doing that is not being remote. It's thinking that means we can't do the stuff, and it's overcoming your own mental barriers to how you do it. Here we are having a really good chat. Yeah. And we've never met in person.
Yeah. I don't know about you, Hilary, but when lockdown happened, I went, I can't do coaching anymore. I can't possibly do coaching. And of course, everyone's now doing coaching. Chris, you've got your final question.
I think we've answered it, really. And I really love that as a bookend towards today. The final question was going to be like any kind of final one thing that you'd urge C-suite leaders to think about to improve their sort of relationships. But I really like that, the 4 hows. I know it wasn't yours. You've taken it from the CEO.
That's steal with pride.
Yeah, it's absolutely fantastic. It's absolutely fantastic. Hilary, thank you very much for today. It's been a really insightful chat. As you just said, 3 people that haven't met, but chewed the fat on a fascinating topic around leadership, the involvement in leaders, the balance that's needed, the breaking down of silos and stereotypes. Lots to unpick there, but thank you very much for joining us.
That's a pleasure. It's been delightful to join you. And let me know if ever you want to chat again. Be delighted to join you.
Thanks, Hilary. Just remind us where we can find you.
So you can find me at www.coachingforexcellence.co.uk. You can find me on LinkedIn, Hilary Gee, so HILARYGEE on LinkedIn. And do reach out if you want to have a chat. If you want to look at what I'm doing, you'll see it on my website. And always happy to chat to people about challenges, aims, goals, and how to achieve them.
Absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
I feel like we could have had this conversation for another 2 to 3 hours.
Yeah.
Really appreciate your time. So thank you for joining us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you've enjoyed this podcast as much as we've clearly enjoyed this. Debbie, thank you very much for co-hosting with me.
Thank you for having me.
Hilary, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And we thank you for listening, and hopefully we'll catch you next time on the People Agenda podcast. Bye-bye.